like Roger Williams, was banished. "Dear grandfather, did they drive the poor woman into the woods?" exclaimed little Alice, who contrived to feel a human interest even in these discords of polemic divinity. "They did, my darling," replied grandfather, "and the end of her life was so sad, you must not hear it. At her departure, it appears from the best authorities, that she gave the great chair to her friend, Henry Vane. He was a young man of wonderful talents and great learning, who had imbibed the religious opinions of the Puritans, and left England with the intention of spending his life in Massachusetts. The people chose him governor, but the controversy about Mrs. Hutchinson, and other troubles, caused him to leave the country in 1637. You may read the subsequent events of his life in the History of England." "Yes, grandfather," cried Laurence, "and we may read them better in Mr. Upham's Biography of Vane. And what a beautiful death he died, long afterwards." "Beautiful, though it was on a scaffold, many of the most beautiful deaths have been there," said grandfather. "The enemies of a great and good man can in no other way make him so glorious, as by giving him the crown of martyrdom." In order that the children might fully understand the all-important history of the chair, grandfather now thought fit to speak of the progress that was made in settling several colonies. The settlement of Plymouth, in 1620, has already been mentioned. In 1635, Mr. Hooker and Mr. Stone, two ministers, went on foot from Massachusetts to Connecticut, through the pathless woods, taking their whole congregation along with them. They founded the town of Hartford. In 1638, Mr. Davenport, a very celebrated minister, went, with other people, and began a plantation at New Haven. In the same year, some persons who had been persecuted in Massachusetts, went to the Isle of Rhodes, since called Rhode Island, and settled there. About this time, also, many settlers had gone to Maine, and were living without any regular government. There were likewise settlers near Piscataqua River, in the region which is now called New Hampshire. Thus, at various points along the coast of New England, there were communities of Englishmen. Though these communities were independent of one another, yet they had a common dependence upon England, and, at so vast a distance from their native home, the inhabitants must all have felt like brethren. They were fitted to become one united people, at a future period. Perhaps their feelings of brotherhood were the stronger, because different nations had formed settlements to the north and to the south. In Canada and Nova Scotia were colonies of French. On the banks of the Hudson River was a colony of Dutch, who had taken possession of that region many years before, and called it New Netherlands. Grandfather, for aught I know, might have gone on to speak of Maryland and Virginia, for the good old gentleman really seemed to suppose, that the whole surface of the United States was not too broad a foundation to place the four legs of his chair upon. But, happening to glance at Charlie, he perceived that this naughty boy was growing impatient, and meditating another ride upon a stick. So here, for the present, grandfather suspended the history of his chair. Chapter 5. The children had now learned to look upon the chair with an interest, which was almost the same as if it were a conscious being, and could remember the many famous people whom it had held within its arms. Even Charlie, lawless as he was, seemed to feel that this venerable chair must not be clambered upon nor overturned, although he had no scruple in taking such liberties with every other chair in the house. Clara treated it with still greater reverence, often taking occasion to smooth its cushion, and to brush the dust from the carved flowers and grotesque figures of its oaken back and arms. Laurence would sometimes sit a whole hour, especially at twilight, gazing at the chair, and, by the spell of his imaginations, summoning up its ancient occupants to appear in it again. Little Alice evidently employed herself in a similar way, for once, when grandfather had gone abroad, the child was heard talking with the gentle Lady Arbella, as if she were still sitting in the chair. So sweet a child as little Alice may fitly talk with angels, such as the Lady Arbella had long since become. Grandfather was soon importuned for more stories about the chair. He had no difficulty in relating them, for it really seemed as if every person, noted in our early history, had, on some occasion or other, found repose within its comfortable arms. If grandfather took pride in anything, it was in being the possessor of such an honorable and historic elbow chair. I know not precisely who next got possession of the chair, after Governor Vane went back to England, said grandfather. But there is reason to believe that President Dunster sat in it, when he held the first commencement at Harvard College. You have often heard, children, how careful our forefathers were, to give their young people a good education. They had scarcely cut down trees enough to make room for their own dwellings, before they began to think of establishing a college. Their principal object was, to rear up pious and learned ministers, and hence old writers call Harvard College a school of the prophets. Is the college a school of the prophets now? Asked Charlie. "It is a long while since I took my degree, Charlie." "You must ask some of the recent graduates," answered grandfather. "As I was telling you, President Dunster sat in grandfather's chair in 1642, when he conferred the degree of Bachelor of Arts on 9 young men. They were the first in America, who had received that honor. And now, my dear auditors, I must confess that there are contradictory statements and some uncertainty about the adventures of the chair, for a period of almost 10 years. Some say that it was occupied by your own ancestor, William Hawthorne, first Speaker of the House of Representatives. I have nearly satisfied myself, however, that, during most of this questionable period, it was literally the chair of state. It gives me much pleasure to imagine, that several successive governors of Massachusetts sat in it at the council board, but, grandfather," interposed Charlie, who was a matter-of-fact little person, "what reason have you to imagine so? Pray do imagine it, grandfather," said Laurence. "With Charlie's permission, I will," replied grandfather, smiling. "Let us consider it settled, therefore, that Winthrop, Bellingham, Dudley, and Endicott, each of them, when chosen governor, took his seat in our great chair on election day. In this chair, likewise, did those excellent governors preside, while holding consultations with the chief councillors of the province, who were styled assistants. The governor sat in this chair, too, whenever messages were brought to him from the Chamber of Representatives, and here grandfather took occasion to talk, rather tediously, about the nature and forms of government that established themselves, almost spontaneously, in Massachusetts and the other New England colonies. Democracies were the natural growth of the New World. As to Massachusetts, it was at first intended that the colony should be governed by a council in London. But, in a little while, the people had the whole power in their own hands, and chose annually the governor, the councillors, and the representatives. The people of Old England had never enjoyed anything like the liberties and privileges, which the settlers of New England now possessed. And they did not adopt these modes of government after long study, but in simplicity, as if there were no other way for people to be ruled. But, Laurence, continued grandfather, when you want instruction on these points, you must seek it in Mr. Bancroft's history. I am merely telling the history of a chair. To proceed. The period during which the governors sat in our chair, was not very full of striking incidents. The province was now established on a secure foundation, but it did not increase so rapidly as at first, because the Puritans were no longer driven from England by persecution. However, there was still a quiet and natural growth. The legislature incorporated towns, and made new purchases of lands from the Indians. A very memorable event took place in 1643. The colonies of Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, formed a union, for the purpose of assisting each other in difficulties, and for mutual defense against their enemies. They called themselves the United Colonies of New England. Were they under a government like that of the United States? Inquired Laurence. No, replied grandfather, the different colonies did not compose one nation together, it was merely a confederacy among the governments. It somewhat resembled the League of the Amphictyons, which you remember in Grecian history. But to return to our chair. In 1644 it was highly honoured, for Governor Endicott sat in it, when he gave audience to an ambassador from the French governor of Acadie, or Nova Scotia. A treaty of peace, between Massachusetts and the French colony, was then signed. Did England allow Massachusetts to make war and peace with foreign countries? Asked Laurence. Massachusetts, and the whole of New England, was then almost independent of the mother country, said grandfather. There was now a civil war in England, and the king, as you may well suppose, had his hands full at home, and could pay but little attention to these remote colonies. When the Parliament got the power into their hands, they likewise had enough to do in keeping down the Cavaliers. Thus New England, like a young and hardy lad, whose father and mother neglect it, was left to take care of itself. In 1649, King Charles was beheaded. Oliver Cromwell then became Protector of England, and as he was a Puritan himself, and had risen by the valour of the English Puritans, he showed himself a loving and indulgent father to the Puritan colonies in America. Grandfather might have continued to talk in this dull manner, nobody knows how long, but, suspecting that Charlie would find the subject rather dry, he looked sideways at that vivacious little fellow, and saw him give an involuntary yawn. Whereupon, grandfather proceeded with the history of the chair, and related a very entertaining incident, which will be found in the next chapter.